So what's a product manager? Well, honestly, a product manager's job is in their name. They're the one who's responsible for managing a product. And depending on the size of the company, that's going to really vary. So for example, at Google, if you're a product manager, you're probably just going to be responsible for a feature. You're not going to be probably responsible for YouTube as a whole as a product. And same with Microsoft. But if you're at a startup, you might have a greater scope in terms of what that means. So you'd have your product might be something a lot bigger. But ultimately, as the PM, your job is to ship that product and launch new features. So what does that mean? It means the PM is the one who's responsible for the strategy, setting the vision, defining success, and making all the product related decisions. The thing is though, the PM isn't really anyone's boss or manager. They manage the different teams, so working with the design team, the engineering team, and the business team. And they're not necessarily telling them what to do, like go build this feature. They're working with them all collaboratively. So for example, as a product manager myself, I don't lead any developers, but I work with a lead developer who leads a team of 15 software engineers. And it's not my responsibility for me to tell him like, hey, this is what you're going to do, this is how you're going to do it. But I work with him collaboratively. So I would come to him and be like, hey, this is the data we're seeing. This is the pain point we found. This is the product feature solution that we think is going to take care of it. And then they'll come back and be like, oh, well, we think we have different priorities. And then it's my job to ultimately convince the team to go like, look, this is the number one priority because, and come up with the business case. So that might be to reduce cost, increase revenue, anything to really support the decision for making that product. And I'm responsible for being the voice of the customer. So the one who's supposed to essentially like voice their opinion, be like, oh, but our customers really need this. Because the dev team, the design team, the business team aren't the ones who are interacting with the customer on a daily basis or even monthly basis. They're kind of looking to you to find what those needs and pain points are. So it's your job to lead and inspire them through your vision and the data that you collect. I think what the really appealing part of being the product manager though, in that situation though, is you're the one who's sitting at that intersection between the developers, the design team, and the business team. And you're responsible for making sure that all of these teams are aligned. So knowing what the number one goal is at the time, knowing what the number one problem is, and driving all these people to work in the same direction. And I think what a lot of people ask though is like, oh, like what does your day-to-day look like? And that's the thing. The day-to-day of a product manager is always different. It's incredibly ambiguous. And even my manager comes in and he told me, he's like, yeah, every day I walk in, I don't know what I'm gonna do. And as the PM, it's really your responsibility to go after whatever the number one priority of the day is. And if you ask most product managers, like, what is your day like? They're gonna be like, well, it depends. It depends on where the product is in its life cycle. So did you just launch it or is it brand new? It depends on the size of the product. It depends on what team you're in, what organization you're in within a company. Are you working in a big company, a small company? Ultimately, it really varies. But I think the number one factor of where it varies is the design schedule. So if the team just launched a new product feature, then a big part of your responsibility is going to be tackling bugs, working with customers to make sure you get feedback, collecting data to measure success. But when you're ramping up into that new feature cycle, then your job is going to be looking at pain points and how can we solve these and what's the number one feature that we want to prioritize building. But what are some common responsibilities of a product manager? Well, one is writing the spec for the upcoming product you're releasing. Another one is working with the user research team to figure out how people are using your product. Reaching out to users to figure out common complaints of them and then trying to figure out how you're going to solve them. Trying to convince the engineering team why they need to build feature X instead of feature Y. Working with markets and data analytics to measure the success of a product launch. Attending conferences to market and explain your product to users. Evaluating product risks and trade-offs. Analyzing the market and competitor products. And ultimately being the one who is responsible for aligning all of those teams across your product. So that means attending a lot of daily meetings. This kind of, as you can tell with all these responsibilities though, What really comes down to being a product manager is you're the person in the organization that has the most contacts about your product or whatever you're working on. You know exactly how the front end works, the back end works, what the business case for it is, what's the go-to strategy, and everything about your product, and then aligning that among the legal team, the sales team, the marketing team, the UX team, the research team, the business team, and basically anyone else that is involved in touching your product or whose product involves that. So wherever your product's running on their servers, security issues, compliance, all of those things come down to the product manager knowing the most about all of them and then be able to communicate that among all the different teams. So as I talked about a little bit before, but your responsibilities are going to vary among the product lifecycle or where you are in that stage. And the product lifecycle can essentially be generalized into three main stages. First is the discovery phase, second is the planning phase, and third is the execution phase. Now, among every company, they're going to have different timelines, so maybe a 6-month product cycle or a year or 2 years, and it's going to vary. But regardless of where you are as a company, it's going to fit into those three categories. What the first phase is, the discovery phase. This is really about data collection and working with the marketing team, the user research team to figure out what are the common problems among your product. So even if you already have an existing product or you're launching one for the first time, the discovery phase is where you're going to collect information on trying to figure out what you're going to target and why. What's the number one priority? What's the number one problem? The next phase is the planning phase. This is really where you're going to decide on the features and start scoping out the next few months on what you're going to do. So in the planning phase, you're going to get alignment on all the teams. So the user research team, the engineering team, the design team, all the teams we've talked about in the past, but making sure everyone knows what those number one problems are and how we're going to tackle them going forward. Also, a really big part of your responsibility during the planning phase is going to be actually writing the spec. So writing out what is the user story that your feature is going to tackle. What are the engineering challenges you're going to have to face? What is the back end of your product going to be look like? And you're not necessarily doing this on your own. For example, at Microsoft, we work with the engineering lead, and the PMs are the one responsible doing the part of the functional spec. So what does the product look like? What are the use cases? What is it going to do? And then the engineering team comes in and writes how is it going to do that? Because that's ultimately what they're best in. And then finally, the execution phase. This is where you're going to launch the product and then essentially monitor it for problems. So going through the debug exercise and looking for as many bugs as possible in your product before it launches, measuring the success of it. So do people like using your product? What are some problems? What are complaints? Does it work well? And essentially collecting all of that feedback. But again, those are the three main stages. And regardless of whatever company you're going, they may call it something different, but that is what the product lifecycle is going to look at that company. But those are really the main responsibilities of the product manager. They're the person who's building the consensus among the team, measuring user feedback, conducting A/B tests to figure out what was the best way to do something, and really defining success. They're the one who get to actually make the product decisions, but they only get to do that if they have support from their team, their executives, and the other people who are working on their product. And I hope that gives you a better understanding of what the role of a product manager actually entails.